Flight attendants, both past and present, what's the most entitled behavior you've seen from a passenger? Not an attendant, but once got stranded at Newark for 22 hours after our flight had an unfixable fault and was canceled late at night. We got put up in a hotel, but understandably, by the time the new flight rolled around, early as they could fit in a new flight, everyone was quite tired and agitated. As we're waiting to board the new flight, the flight attendant announces they would be boarding people with additional needs and families with young children first, followed by first class, then premium economy, etc., etc. All pretty standard stuff. Obviously, it can take a bit longer for people in wheelchairs to board, so it makes sense for them to go on first. It's common on most airlines, I believe. Anyway, this business dude races to the front of the crowd and starts yelling at the attendant, saying it was already disgusting that he had lost a day due to their incompetence. And now he had to wait even longer despite being a first-class passenger and paying money every year to fly with them. The worst part is he's looking at others in the crowd to back him up like it's perfectly reasonable to scream at this woman who, like us, had also been stranded and had most likely had very little sleep and was doing her best to do her job in this difficult situation. But she was awesome. Without missing a beat, she smiled and nodded and said, "Okay, sir." Then made a big point of leaning into her mic and telling the waiting line of people in wheelchairs and mothers with babies that this gentleman needed to board before them and could they please wait. Literally, every single person at the gate is looking at this guy with disgust as he tries to backtrack and say he doesn't mind waiting for the first group. But the attendant says, No, you made yourself quite clear. Let's get you boarded. The others will have to wait." He is humiliated as he sheepishly walks by. She handled it perfectly. Well, that guy got what he deserved, eh? A lesson in humility and courtesy of a flight attendant. Story 2. Mid-90s, there was this kid in customs, Toronto to Houston flight who was going crazy. He was driving people crazy in the departure area. On the flight, he had a full-size metal Tonka truck that he was running up and down the aisle with. He smacked me on the head and nearly hit my mom in front of me. I grabbed it before he could hit my very frail mom. I gave it to a crew member who refused to give it back to the family. The family refused to seat him until it was announced that there would be no food or beverage service until the aisle was cleared. Another woman grabbed the kid and returned him to his family. They let him run loose again as soon as service was over. Finally, someone from the cockpit had to come back and tell the family we couldn't start the landing approach until the kid was in his seat. They put him in his seat, screaming. As soon as descent started, they let him up and he was running up and down the aisle as we landed. The family was just so dense that when the captain ordered everyone to stay in their damn seats and that only families with small children would be allowed to deplane at first, they smirked their way down the aisle. Mom walked with a cane, and the crush getting off was hard for her. Since we were home, we just waited till the aisles were clear. When we got off, you could hear the kid screaming halfway down the jetway. A police officer was holding him and the rest of the family, I'm guessing mom, dad, and 2 grandparents, were in handcuffs. Story 3. I'm a passenger, not a flight attendant, but it's a good story nonetheless. I was on a flight from NYC to PDX. Only empty seat was next to me, a middle seat, bulkhead, but the kind where there isn't a wall, just the first-class seats in front of us. Doors about to close when a large, sweaty man comes running onto the plane to claim the empty seat. He was carrying a full-size pizza box. All overhead bins were already closed and full, but that didn't stop him from proceeding to open them to find a place to stash his pizza. The stewardess kindly informed him that he couldn't put his pizza in an overhead bin. "But it'll get stepped on," he gruffly informs her. She proceeded to tell him to take his seat and put the pizza in front of him. He told her that he flies with pizza all the time and has never been treated this way. He persisted, but as their argument was getting pretty heated, he finally succumbed and put the pizza under the seat in front of him and sat down. The stewardesses have now started the safety video demonstration thingy, and he pulls out a flip phone and proceeds to make a call. I can tell he's going through menus, so I'm thinking he's calling Delta to complain. Nope, turns out to be his landline phone company. He'd been late paying his bill and was trying to get them to waive the late fee. They wouldn't. He's arguing with them, plane is pushed back from the gate and is headed towards the runway at this point. Stewardess comes over and tells him he needs to put his phone away, now. He motions with his hand to say, 1 minute. "No, sir, it needs to be put away, now." He flips it shut, dramatically, mid-sentence, and puts it in his pocket. Stewardess is back to the front of the plane. He then decides to stretch. I'm pretty much plastered to the wall, trying to stay out of his way as he extends his arms up and then to the side, etc., and then twists in his seat back and forth, clearly agitated. He then extends his arms up, stretches out his fingers, and proceeds to crack his knuckles very expressively, one at a time, sort of like what a mean primary schooler would do on the playground before they were going to defeat you. In that whole knuckle-cracking process, he flips a middle finger toward the flight attendant. I didn't notice her reaction as I was just waiting to get the 6-hour flight underway and over with. Next thing I know, I can tell we're pulling back into the gate. Flight attendants prepare for arrival and cross-check message. Door opens, cockpit door opens, captain comes to our row. Sir, I understand you were pestering my flight attendant. I need you to leave the plane now. The pizza man attempted to argue and even asked me and the other neighboring passenger if we had witnessed anything. Clearly, the pilot wasn't budging on his decision, so the guy got his pizza off the floor and left the plane. Door closed and we departed. Empty seat next to me. Story 4. Currently a FA flying 5 years for a legacy carrier. I have a few that pop into my head. One was I was working a quick turn at the end of a 3-day shift, and we had a medical emergency in first class where a passenger passed out. We had to give him CPR and hook him up to an AED, so 2 of us were with the man and the other FA was paging a doctor and communicating with the captain. While this was going on, a passenger in the first row of the main cabin, who can clearly see everything going on, kept paging it for a cola and getting very upset that we wouldn't serve him. Finally, a commuting FA stepped in for us and had a word with him. Another one was actually my last trip, and a woman who boarded towards the end sitting row in 10A who left her bag in the aisle, blocking everyone else trying to get on because she was looking for a place for her bag. She found a spot towards the back and put her hand in the air and started snapping and hollering at me to get her bag for her. I went up to her and told her to get her bag out of the aisle. She got in my face and demanded that I needed to put it up, which I told her I could not lift her bag for her. She threw a fit. Finally, a nice gentleman helped her. Anyways, after boarding, she accused me of stealing her fur scarf. I didn't. Then she called me a little blonde witch. She was removed. I had a lady mother another time get mad at me because I wouldn't give her my personal food I brought from home and paid for with my own money. She said she was hungry and she needed it. Nope. Another flight, I had a man and a small kid on a flight, and he, during boarding, asked me for one of the first-class meals I was preparing, and I asked where he was sitting. Once he sat in a row in main cabin, I told him, I'm sorry, but these are first class, but we do have food for purchase in the main cabin. He then told me that his kid was hungry and demanded that we give him free food. I kept saying, I'm sorry, sure, but the food is for purchase. He didn't think it was fair that he had to pay for food because he had a hungry kid. Story 5. The seat switch scam, SSS, has happened to me more times than it should have. I'm a college student, and thus, naturally, people, especially couples with babies, think that it would be much easier to force me into switching. There was this one time I was on a really long flight from Chicago to India. I usually never haggle much about seats, and I'm pretty cool about switching if people ask me for it. I have this awful quality of trying to avoid conflict in any way possible. This time, I was fortunate enough to get one of those front seats with a lot of legroom. I knew this seemed too good to be true, and at any moment, a couple with a baby would request for the seat to which I will cave. Needless to say, minutes later, this couple came up to me with the flight attendant asking me to switch because they had a baby, and the father was sitting next to me. The mother had a middle seat way back into the plane for a very long flight. Although I was hesitant, with 3 people awkwardly waiting on me to say yes, I eventually caved. As I was moving my stuff, one of my small empty plastic bottles fell from my bag and nearly hit the father. Now, you have to understand that this was one of those light plastic water bottles that could barely hurt you if you try to hit someone with it, let alone when it fell from the bag. But for some reason, that angered the father into believing that it could have somehow seriously injured their baby. Even after apologizing to him for a solid minute, he kept shouting at me about how careless I was and that I need to learn plane etiquette. And that just did it for me. I told him that I was no longer comfortable with the switch and just went back to my seat and pretended super hard to fall asleep. The entire flight, he did try his best to annoy me, fighting me on the handrest, making it hard for me to move around, etc. But I never felt so good about my plane etiquette. Story 6. Passenger tale. I was on a flight from the UK to Ibiza with a group of close friends flying out for a friend's wedding. We were looking forward to the flight until we took our seats and heard some really overbearing, clearly inebriated guys taking their seats behind us. They must have been in their mid to late 20s. One of them was actually being carried by 2 friends and lulling his head. As the plane took off, said guys retched all over himself and his friends were in hysterics. We were all openly in shock and disgusted that someone that hammered could be allowed on a plane and that he'd literally chundered all over himself. It smelled vile. It must have been about a good 10 minutes later when 2 of the guys, the party totaled like 7 to 8, and they were all sitting in a line, got into an argument, and one of them got up and started strutting to another seat while we were still taking off, seatbelt lights on. The air stewardess came over to him and explained that he couldn't move seats and he needed to move back once the seatbelt sign went off. He refused to move but started chatting her up and she went along with it. The light goes off and then the other friend, argument friend, gets out of his seat and approaches the guy who moved. The next thing you know, they're having a fight, physical, in the aisle, rolling around on the floor, and I swear to God, you could feel the plane moving slightly with it. People around were trying to stand up and leave their seats to get away from them. The stewardesses pulled them apart and eventually got them both to sit back down in separate seats, but I just remember how the stewardesses kept flirting back with them to keep the peace. I couldn't believe that the plane didn't turn around and that we then carried on with these absolute idiots on board. They were even allowed to board in the first place. I've not flown with Ryanair since. Story 7. Not a FA, but had the opportunity to help out a couple back in the day. A fellow passenger across the aisle pretty much thought he was flying private instead of being on a commercial carrier. Always pressing the overhead button and making demands, no pleases, not a thank you, just a constant barrage of orders. The end came when he pressed the button and shouted, "Get me a drink now, I want a scotch with a splash of soda and not too much ice." The FA was very accommodating in spite of this person being a total schmuck. She brings the drink, hands it to him, and he bellows, "There's too much ice in this drink, make me another." She was dumbfounded, and at this point very flustered. She turned around and headed to the galley at the front of the plane. The lead FA comes back and proceeds to tell this man that he needs to behave, etc. Well, that just made him amp it up. Wait for it. "Do you know who I am? I'm a very good longtime friend of Mr. X. You know him, one of the executives at your airline. He's a personal friend whom I've known for years. Give me your name and the name of the idiot who can't make a decent scotch and soda." I chime in at this point. "Sir, if Mr. X is a longtime personal friend, what is his nickname?" His very good friends address him with his nickname, not his surname. He looks perplexed and then tells me to mind my business. The FA tells me very nicely to not involve myself and she will handle this. He says, "You're damn right, you'd better handle this." I reached into my wallet and pulled out a picture taken on my wedding day that had me in my suit, the new wife in her wedding dress, and my new in-laws, one of whom is Mr. X. I handed it to the FA and said that I will call the office when we land and let him know that one of his very good friends is dropping his name and treating members of the flight crew in a very unprofessional manner. "Sir, may I have your name so I can tell my father-in-law that you're going to make a formal complaint against members of the cabin crew?" Crickets. Nay, but a peep. The lead FA hands me back my picture and tells the guy if he touches the button again or even speaks to any of the FAs, the police will be waiting for him when we land. I called the father-in-law after we landed to fill him in, just in case. I found out much later that he pulled the passenger manifest and wrote the guy a letter banning him from traveling on the airline. Story 8. So, here's a good one. I was, still am, but working on it, a fat guy. My new employer sent me out to the UK. Admittedly, I understand that being fat makes flying with me a pain in the bag. To my benefit, though, I do try and squeeze myself into a corner or out into the aisle, whatever I can do to minimize the frustration of my neighbor. I don't put the seats back, I don't use a table, I ask if they want the window raised or lowered if I'm a window seat. I don't talk, fart, eat, get up to use the restroom. I don't use the restroom at all on flights. This included the 12 or some odd hour flight to Heathrow. Essentially, I understand I'm a hassle to fly with, and I do my absolute best to minimize your hatred of me, which I admittedly deserve. To that end, however, I remember flying out to Heathrow, and about 20 minutes into the air, the guy looks over at me and says, "Yeah, this isn't going to work." I looked at him back and said, "I'm sorry?" He stated, "Look, this isn't going to be a comfortable flight for either of us. One of us needs to move," and looks pointedly at me. I tell him, "I'm sorry, I can't fix this right now." So he hits the light and calls out, "Excuse me, ma'am," to the flight attendant at the front of the class cabin. She comes back and he says as loudly as he can without actually shouting, "Look, I have a problem with this guy here. One of us needs to move and it should be him." To her credit, she surveyed the cabin and saw only middle row seats were available and seemed to understand the situation. "Sir, you may move to any of these open seats," looking at him. Now, again, I know I'm going to take flack on here, but the reality is that people are fatter than they were 30 to 60 years ago. They're also taller. Airlines maximize money by packing more people into a smaller area. I don't enjoy being that guy, but I didn't know even 3 weeks out that I was going to be flying to the UK. Not much I could have changed in 3 weeks. Oh well. Yeah, the airline should really invest in bigger seats, more space, not just more of them to pack even more people into even smaller places. It's a lose-lose situation for all of us, skinny or fat, or in the middle, for that matter. Story 9. Not a flight attendant, but I do travel plenty. Lesson here, holding your temper and being kind is important everywhere. So, flying back to SFO on Christmas Eve, I upgraded my flight to first class as a little treat-yourself present. I was in the back row on the right, and across the aisle seat was a young, burnt-out-looking dime store heiress with the entitled scowl to match. At first, she seems pretty harmless, all curled up in her seat like an upset child. Her knees were bruised up, and I figured she'd been on some party bender as a previous flight came in from the Caribbean and was worn out. No, she was simply warming up. As the plane began its ascent and the flight attendants went through safety demonstrations, she pulled out her phone, called someone, and began having a vapid, full-volume conversation. The flight attendants ignored that at first, but once the conversation ended, she started playing music on the speaker of her phone, just sitting there blasting her tunes as if any of us could ignore her to begin with. The attendant in charge of our section came over and asked, with gentle and kind restraint, if she needed any headphones. The young woman rolled her eyes and huffled, "No, it's fine, I have headphones." All is quiet for a bit until dinner service, then calamity. Of the two options, only beef was left over after we ordered. When the flight attendant informed me I would not be able to have my preferred meal, I was a bit huffy and flustered as I had been trying to get the seat to recline for 10 minutes and was getting a little frazzled. I went for the beef and got back to messing with my seat in vain. My dear neighbor across the way was apparently a vegetarian and quite upset that her only option was a personal cheese pizza. Admittedly, a little lackluster when compared to the original veg option. Not content with grumpily eating her substitution meal, she made a scene instead by slamming her tray onto the aisle and storming the entire length of the plane to the bathrooms in the back. All eyes on our lady of perpetual tantrum, who I will henceforth call Ugly Face McGee. I'm unsure what she did in the back of the plane, but as she eventually came back to her comfy chair at the front, feeling a little ashamed of my own huffiness, I made sure to apologize to the flight attendant when she took our trays and let her know the meal option was great. I was just flustered because I couldn't get my seat to recline. Mostly, I felt bad watching them have to deal with Ugly Face McGee. The flight continues for another hour without incident. Ugly Face McGee seems absorbed in something else, and I start having a fun conversation with my seatmate about travels, holidays, and where we live. Perhaps I was laughing too loud, though I don't think so, because the piece soon ended. Suddenly, the petulant neighbor is out of her seat and in confrontation mode, standing over my seatmate and glaring at me. "Oh my God, you are so loud. I swear to God I can hear your entire conversation. The last 3 hours I've been listening to your voice," she yelled. We are obviously all Americans, what with the all caps volume and stunted insult vocabulary. I sipped my drink and just nodded my head at her saying, "Okay, all right, until she sat down. A moment passed and the flight attendant came up to see what was going on and asked if she was pestering me. I gave her a big smile and announced in my clearest voice, "No, it's okay, she's just a witch." She smiled and said in a quiet voice, "I'll take good care of you. Another drink?" Not only did she keep my gin and tonics top for the rest of the flight, she gave me a sizable amount of air miles as an apology for the malfunctioning seat. Secretly, I think it was for referring to Ugly Face McGee by her true form. Be nice to flight attendants. Their goal is to keep you safe and bring you some drinks, not be your punching bags. And if you're enjoying the video so far, please don't forget to hit that subscribe and like button for more videos just like this. Story 10. I was a kid flying out to Utah to start my teen tour. About halfway through the flight, departing out of New York, the captain got on the speaker to announce an engine had failed and we needed to make an emergency landing in Chicago. Needless to say, we got a little concerned, except for one passenger who stormed up to the flight attendant and explained she was a nanny and needed to get to Utah to attend to the children she took care of. I'm not exactly sure what she was hoping for, that the pilot, upon hearing that a babysitter was on board, would risk the lives of everyone to fly us all through, or that the flight attendant would be so moved by this story that she would climb out on the wing and repair the engine mid-flight. Alas, there was no emergency jetpack to give this passenger to blast away from the plane to get to Utah on time, and she was told to sit down. Story 11. Not a flight attendant, but I do fly a lot, and I was on a plane where half the plane was ignoring the rules and stuff. When we touched down, these people immediately got up, walking around, and started taking their bags out of the overheads. Mind you, the plane hasn't parked, it's just literally touched the floor of the landing strip, so it's still moving, and it's dangerous for half the people on the plane to be messing around and even worse, taking all their heavy bags down above everyone else's heads. The flight attendants are now desperately trying to get these people to sit down until the plane stops moving, and some people were waving their hands at them dismissively. I think the captain heard the commotion and the flight attendants half yelled because all of a sudden the plane made a very abrupt stop, which knocked over all the people standing up and then continued to park. The flight attendant then said, "This is exactly why we have rules, LOL. Story 12. I'm 6 feet tall with most of the length in my legs, and I fly a lot, so I've run into a schmuck or two. Almost every plane I get in, my knees are already touching the seat in front of me. If the person in front of me reclines, the only way for me to sit is to straighten out my legs and shoot them underneath the seat in front of me. I was probably 16, still 6 foot, and the guy in front of me couldn't have been more than 24. He reclines and his seat practically hits me in the chest. I could smell his hair, he was so close. We asked him to put the seat up a bit, but he declined. The seat was clearly broken and reclined a good 6 inches past the other seats in his row, so we called over the flight attendant. She also saw the problem and asked him to put his seat up and told him it was broken. He said no, and she said there was nothing else she could do. Great, thanks. Luckily, my mom is the pack everything you may need on a plane mom, so I get an idea. I start eating pretzels with my mouth wide open and get crumbs all over his head and shoulders. He doesn't notice until the crumbs are bouncing off his shoulder crumbs and into his lap. It was gross. He turns around with a look of disgust and asks me to stop. I got great pleasure in telling him no and showing him the rest of the bag of pretzels I had to eat over him. He put the seat up. Well, there's one way to get some leg room, a very messy way, but effective nonetheless, one I gotta remember. Story 13. I was a passenger, not an attendant, but the story still stands. About a year ago on a flight from SAC to CAA, a woman with a service dog came on the plane. She sat in the front row seats on a Southwest flight. After pre-boarding, a very hammered man, his wife, and their baby come on the plane. The man demanded that the woman with the service dog move because he wanted the front seats for his family. When she told him she would not move, he began grabbing her bags and throwing them in the aisle. The attendants came and told him that he could not move a passenger seat. He then grabbed the service dog by the harness and began yanking it out into the aisle. The woman was crying at this time, begging for help. The man was told that if he continued, he and his family would have to deboard the plane. The man finally stopped but put his carry-on in the bin above where the woman was sitting before taking a seat further back. The entire flight there were complaints that his wife was holding their baby on the tray table, who was pulling the passenger's hair in front of them. She was changing diapers in the seat and disgustingly storing them in the seat pocket in front of them. When the plane landed, the man and his wife pushed through the aisles, yelling that they needed their carry-on, and in the process shoved a woman with a full leg brace and a cane back into her seat. They were removed from the plane, though it was too late. The damage had already been done. This was by far the worst set of passengers I have ever encountered on a plane. Story 14. Passenger. When an 8-hour flight to Florida, a family of 5 boarded first and then demanded the attendants rearrange their kids' seat to be all together. I get it. I'm a mom now too, but they occupied my seat, in fact, the entire row, while the flight attendant tried to arrange them all to sit together. I politely asked them to sit down and they just ignored us. Asked again and they said no, we were waiting for our seats and that I could probably wait at the back of the plane. I just crossed my arms and stared them down. I held up the whole plane and I do feel bad about that, but I made it clear it was the entitled family that was the holdup and not me. They finally moved to go wait at the back of the plane. I can't stand people that think they are higher class just because they have kids. I had no problem with them wanting to be seated together. They most likely specified that and the airline probably messed up. Happens all the time. I had no problem with them boarding first, although family priority seating is mainly to make things go smoothly. The obvious entitlement was that they occupied a seat that I paid for, refused to move, and then told me that I should wait in the back holding my luggage until their accommodation was made, because they were too good for that and so much more important. Story 15. Not an FA, but a passenger. 19 years ago, my grandma had passed away, got the earliest flight back that I could, SFO, to the UK, missed the funeral as Jewish, and left behind a somewhat unresolved love at the airport. So there's me, miserable, eyes constantly leaking. I tilt my seat back so I can try to sleep on this 8-hour flight of sadness. Loudmouth idiot behind me shoves my seat back up seriously hard, like full-on bam. Starts banging on to his stupid mate and their stupid wives how, see, I showed them, outrageous, trying to shove their seat into my lap, blah, 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 blah. Proceeded to shove his knees into the back of my seat so I couldn't put the seat back at all, and continued to laugh loudly about how amazing he is for not letting me encroach on his space, then starts dribbling on about how his holiday had been ruined by all the foreigners and getting ripped off, and I'm not tipping no one, why should I? FA comes over, she'd seen it all go down, leans over to me and apologizes that it's a full flight so she can't move me, but how about a drink? Passes me the first of many free drinks, gives Idiot and the Idiot's clan the most epic hard stare I've ever seen, Idiot 1 quiets down, and proceeds to ignore them and their calls the entire flight. I passed out shortly after from the 2 free scotches, but honestly, thank you to that FA. She made a truly awful experience manageable. If that idiot is still out there flying, I apologize from my entire country. Story 16. Obligatory not a flight attendant. My mom and I were flying back to the States after visiting family in DR. I was a kid, like 7 or 8. But apparently there was some mix-up and they somehow double-booked my mom's seat. We were there first, and the other lady who had the seat came by and demanded that my mom move. She was traveling alone, so you'd think logically the person with the small child should stay, especially since we were there first and there weren't any other seats right next to each other. But there were single seats, so it would be easier for her to relocate. But nah, she just screamed at my mom until eventually my mom gave up and took me to try finding seats close enough together that we wouldn't be separated. The lady tried stopping her and said I could stay with her, and apparently I went, "No, you're mean." I don't remember saying this though, but I do remember being very shocked about her offering that. Thankfully, someone else moved to let us sit together, but I still have no idea what that lady's problem was since it's not like the flight was 100% full, so she literally could have sat anywhere else. The seat wasn't even at the front or anything either. Story 17. I'm another non-flight attendant, but back when I was 13 or so, my family and I were all in business class since we were going on a pleasure trip to the same place as my dad's work trip. I could be remembering wrong, but either way, we were all in not economy, lol. Anyway, this woman is sitting alone next to me, and her husband, a tall, balding, and rather large white dude, comes up to me, a small 13-year-old Asian kid, and asked me directly to switch seats with him. He was like 4 rows back in economy class so he can sit with his wife. I'm very alarmed and actually struck speechless since A, I'd be separated from my entire family, and B, dude, I'm like a baby. All I can do is shake my head, and he continues to pester me about it, towering over me until my dad notices and starts shouting at him about how I was just a kid, just have your wife move, blah, 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 blah. And it's a mess with even other strangers taking our side. Words back and forth until I think a flight attendant stepped in, making both the man and his wife sit in economy with a nicer older couple coming up instead, leaning over and apologizing for the other couple's actions, even though she didn't know them and obviously had nothing to do with them. Before they're even gone, everyone in the section starts saying how glad they were that they were moved back, lol. Story 18. Obligatory not an FA, but one time I was flying out of Heathrow back to my native Belfast. I was in an aisle seat and there was a guy behind me who was digging his knees into my back. Now I get it, it's not comfortable on a plane, but there are ways and means. If you have long legs, put your baggage in the locker and use the space under the seat ahead to stretch out, or, move your legs so they're not digging into the spine of the person ahead of you, and pay attention to the beverage cart. At first, I thought it was an honest mistake, so I put my hand behind my back so he would realize that he was digging his knees into a person. This worked briefly, but soon I felt that kneecap back between my vertebrae. Hands go back, knee moves, head moves, knees go back. This carries on for about 10 minutes. Finally, I've had enough. I move my hand away and wait for the inevitable kneecap. Kneecap arrives. I put my hand back, grab the knee, and I squeeze that as hard as I could, using my best guess as to the pressure points. Knee goes away and does not return. I tried to make eye contact as we were disembarking. He was an ordinary-looking guy, not too tall, not too fat. Guess he really just wanted to put his knees on my back? Story 19. Daughter of a captain here. I've heard some pretty interesting stories from my dad. He's been in the field for almost 30 years. One time, my father had to make an emergency stop to have a passenger be escorted out of the plane. The man was rude to the crew and passengers around him. He didn't want to eat the food that was given to him, and when the crew told him they didn't have anything else for him, he dumped the food on the floor. He was pestering female passengers and even started shouting when a female crew member told him to stop. My dad had to come out of the cockpit and had to arrest him. I live in the Netherlands, and my father told me that when they're in the air, he has that kind of power, but as soon as the door of the plane opens, that power is given over to the country they landed in. I'm not sure how to properly explain this, but my father is a tough man, but he was a little hesitant to do so. The man was over 6 feet tall and pretty buff too. He wasn't happy to be told by my father that he had to leave the plane, but as soon as he saw my father, probably because my father was the first crew member that was a man, my dad assumed, he calmed down significantly and didn't seem too bothered to have to leave the plane. It almost looked like he didn't want to be there in the first place. They made the stop and he left in the hands of the authority that was waiting for him there. Not as terrible as some of the stories here, but I still thought it was something to share. Story 20. I'm a little late to the game on this one, but sharing a few anyway. I had one strap his bag to my jump seat when he couldn't find space for it in the overhead. I had one threaten me when I wouldn't let him upgrade to first for free. There were 12 passengers booked on the whole flight. Aircraft capacity was like 106 or something like that. Christmas Eve, I took a rollerboard to the face. It was an accident. The guy just used too much force trying to get it into the overhead. However, when his wife suggested he apologize to me, he said that wouldn't be necessary, that I must be used to this kind of thing. But my all-time favorite was when we had a medical emergency and we needed to get the AED out. While I had my hands full of medical equipment and we were paging for doctors, a woman grabs my dress and yanks it to get my attention. Also, please don't ever do this. I turn thinking maybe she's a doctor. Nope, she wants a Diet Cola because we skipped her. The good news is this usually isn't common behavior, but after 10 years, I definitely could write a book on some of the more ridiculous things I've experienced. Story 21. Not a flight attendant, but I was flying out of a small island airport when my flight was canceled. Luckily, there was another flight that was only half full going out later in the day. As soon as the cancellation was announced, I ran to the counter to get rebooked on the next flight. I was second in line. There were 2 lines for rebooking, which is relevant. The couple ahead of me had status and spent 15 minutes arguing with the gate agent to get out on the canceled flight, repeatedly telling her that they had status and the airline should let them on the canceled flight. They even offered the agent money if she would uncancel the flight. How they were supposedly frequent flyers yet didn't know what canceled meant was beyond me. They finally agreed to get on the next flight out. However, they then realized that the first class was full. They argued for another 15 minutes to get a first class ticket out. Meanwhile, the other line was moving fast and had already booked about 50 people. The couple finally gave up and took coach seats on the next flight. I then got one of the last seats on the plane, but those schmucks caused many people behind me to not even get seats even though they were in line before the other people in the other line. And people asked me why I didn't say something to the couple to get them to move on. Well, the agent didn't say anything, and considering what us low-class people get kicked off flights for, I didn't want to take any chances and piss anyone off. Story 22. Once in the last leg of transfers to get home, I was boarding a Southwest flight into Dallas. I was the first 3 people to board, the woman directly in front of me, a woman who was dressed in a business suit with a rolling office behind her, papers coming out of pockets, laptop sticking out, purse over shoulder. She proceeded to stop on row 1, leaving her rolling office in the aisle while she bent over the seat to fumble in her purse. I lost my cool. Hey, princess, take your time. The remaining 140 people behind you will all wait while you hold us up. She looked at me in shock and huffed and puffed and gathered the office up to the seat. The flight attendant was in the aisle about 4 rows back and gave me eye contact. I went to a row in the middle of the plane, grabbed a window seat and sat down. Flight was off the ground. Flight attendant comes and plops down in the empty seat next to me. OMG, you're fantastic. But just in case she calls and complains, can we have your email to tell your side of the story and can I get you a drink for me? Story 23. This was in Southeast Asia. You haven't seen entitlement until you fly economy with a load of mainland Chinese tourists. Some are great. Most are the epitome of spoiled brat princes and princesses. I was flying from Thailand to Vietnam and this large group of Chinese tourists came on board probably 5 minutes before takeoff. They proceed to yell and scream, hit every person with their bags, and then discover there simply isn't enough space in the overhead compartments. This one lady actually started taking out other people's bags and ended up in a fight with other passengers. The stewardess then decided to put her luggage in some employee compartment or something. The flight was horrendous. They wouldn't sit down for up during takeoff, were extremely loud, and simply didn't respect others on the flight. Well, it's finally coming to a close, and the same lady who removed people's bags is having a cup of noodles when she starts screaming at the stewardess. She had been asked to prepare for landing, seat up, blinds up, etc., and started screaming in Cantonese. After about 1 minute, she proceeds to throw the almost boiling cup of noodles all over the stewardess. It was absolute chaos. When we landed, the police were waiting for her and immediately took her somewhere. The entire time, she was screaming while I couldn't understand what she was saying. You could just tell that it was this entitled BS like people who scream and yell when arrested for doing obviously illegal stuff. Story 24. I'm 6 foot tall with most of the length of my legs and I fly a lot, so I've run into a schmuck or two. Almost every plane I get in, my knees are already touching the seat in front of me. If the person in front of me reclines, the only way for me to sit is to straighten out my legs and shoot them underneath the seat in front of me. I was flying home from my grandparents' 50th wedding anniversary celebration. I was sitting next to my grandmother and we were looking at a book of law schools I would be applying to next summer. This is a huge dictionary-sized book, so we needed the tray table down to read it. My legs were trapped against the seat in front of me. Guy in front of me goes to recline and it's a no-go. He tries a few times, but it's just not gonna happen. He then starts trying to slam his body against the seat to recline as if breaking my knees was an acceptable solution to his problem. And when that didn't work, he turned around and told me to stop. I informed him that he should stop trying to break my legs. He threatened to call the flight attendant and I invited him to do so. He hit the button. When the flight attendant arrived, he stood up and pointed a finger at me and became hostile. I'm not aggressive and certainly smarter than that to get in a fight on an airplane, but this guy was upsetting my grandmother, so I stood up. Yeah, I was about a foot taller than him. It was almost comical watching his face and expression change. The flight attendant offered me a new seat, but I explained I was with my grandmother. She realized I wasn't being a tough guy, that he was clearly the instigator, and she removed him. When he had gone, a guy behind me joked, "I think you could have taken him." About 10 people laughed as we had become quite the spectacle. The flight attendant actually came back to apologize to me for him being such a schmuck and offered me a free drink. When I saw him later at baggage, he didn't make eye contact. And if you liked any of these stories and related to at least one or two of them, here's more for you. YouTube thinks you're going to love this. I'll catch you in that video.